So, Professor Gangadharan, thank you very much for inviting
Thank you,
me
ma'am.
to.
Sudharma, madam. Thanks. Thank
Okay,
you,
I'm
sir.
leaving. May I leave now?
Yes, sir. Now, so it's a great opportunity for having Pandey, sir. And that is completing close to 40 years. And the very day in
Yes,
1983, he started teaching. And
uh,
it's today,
of
it's a
course.
joy to remember his the very first teaching day.
Yes, Professor Gangadharan, it was on this very day, the 12th April 1983, that I joined Banaras Hindu University as teacher or lecturer. And I remember how it proved to be something like a very short time. Yesterday, I was narrating this before the uh, honorable teachers and the students of the Department of History, that how I feel that something like a very, it took very, I should say, a small time, or it passed in such a way that I don't feel that I have passed so much like 39 years in Banaras University. So then I feel that I enjoyed I enjoyed my teaching and my engagement with Banaras University for the last 39 years, and really it was a very happy time, and I should say I enjoyed my teaching, I enjoyed my stay, and of course uh, anyone can, because the place which Banaras Hindu University is, I feel it is the result of something like uh, which we call tapasya. It is something like the uh, a good work of the freedom fighters led by Pandit Madan Mohan Malvi, that Banaras Hindu University came into existence. So the Banaras Hindu University has something like a hidden message, or it is something like a radiation, something like uh, an aura. If someone is there, someone will certainly feel good because of the message, the gestalt, the totality of the existence in Banaras University. As far as I can understand, I can share, it has been very good and very intellectually enriching, because the ideals which Pandit Madan Mohan Malvi and his colleagues had for the construction, for the creation, for the development of Banaras University, those ideals were very lofty, very great ideals were there. And everyone, the students who have joined here, I welcome them, and I should say that they are familiar with the ideas, and which is in Sanskrit, uh, which is very much written or inscribed in the identity card, and which reads like this: "Na tuham kamay rajyam, na swargam, na punarbhavam, kamay dukha tattanam prani nam artanashnam." So this is something like an ideal of Banaras University, which Pandit Madan Mohan Malvi and his colleagues, they wanted to see that this is implemented, and that was something like they wanted, as per the Sanatan belief, highest achievement of a Sanatani is to see that someone is just getting a reward, that one is not going to take birth. That is mentioned in that very shlok, very, that natuham kamay rajyam na swargam na punarbhavam. I don't want something like a state or a raj or a kingdom. I don't want something like freed from the cycle of birth and death. I don't want that I should be freed from the cycle of birth and death. Then what do you want? Then it is being answered that I want that the pain of those who are suffering from pain, that should be ended. That should end. That was something like a loftier, a great aim before those who were the founders of Banaras University. that through this university, something like a culture, something like a life, something like a society should develop where each and everyone should be freed from all sorts of pain. So, giving this very preface to whatever I have to say and share with my honorable audience, students of the PhD students, and some of the colleagues who have joined. So, with this preface, I should say that when we discuss about postmodernism, as has been said, and I also had expressed that I would be speaking about postmodernism and the changing epistemology. How epistemology is a very I should say a word which is very full with all the uh, a charisma, a word with a charisma, a word with something sometimes with hidden meanings. But simply epistemology can be translated as something like how someone is going to acquire knowledge, how knowledge is being acquired. Episteme is the method through which someone is going to acquire knowledge, and for that matter, the social scientists and historians, they use the word episteme to describe a person. Like in the last 10 years or more than that, I should say, I have been coming across with the writings on Mahatma Gandhi, and there they mention, the writers, they mention, to understand Mahatma Gandhi, one should know the episteme of Mahatma Gandhi. What is the episteme of Mahatma Gandhi? And the meaning of the episteme of Mahatma Gandhi is that how he was understanding the world. What was the way he was understanding the world? That is episteme. Episteme means how someone has a conceptual scheme, if I'm allowed to say like that, how someone has a cognitive faculty. What type of cognitive faculty? This is a way of expression. What type of cognitive faculty or cognitive tool? What type of cognitive tool someone has to understand the phenomenal world and also beyond that? How to understand this world from the intellectual tool? This episteme is an intellectual tool. Intellectual tool means, translated into very simple way, intellectual tools are the concepts. The concepts are the intellectual tools. So what are the basic concepts someone utilizes, and what are the meanings someone gives to these concepts to grapple with the reality of the society, and also those who believe in something existing beyond the society, that is the transcendental. How the transcendental is being understood, that is also in the ambit of, in the command or in the domain of episteme or and epistemology means to understand the episteme, the knowledge system, the intellectual tool of an individual. So from this very preliminary definition of epistemology, I would come to just share with you, the honorable audience, that how epistemology were different in different periods of time, from ancient to modern to postmodern, how epistemology was different. Like in philosophy, we read about the epistemology in Indian philosophy, epistemology of the Vedanta, those who believe in Vedanta, epistemology of Mimamsa, epistemology of yoga, epistemology of Sankhya, Vaisheshik. These are the Brahmanical schools of thought. Even the epistemology of Jain philosophy, epistemology of the Buddhist philosophy. Epistemology means what is the philosophy of knowledge. Epistemology is also called philosophy of knowledge. And then what is the meaning of philosophy of knowledge? Means how a valid knowledge can be gathered. Philosophy of knowledge can be translated like this. How a valid, and valid means, here valid means acceptable. How someone or some of the persons are going to accept a knowledge as something valid or something which can be just given something like a status that yes, it is knowledge. In that sense, I'm saying valid knowledge. So philosophy of knowledge is epistemology, and I'm just to share with the learned audience that philosophy of knowledge in the very ancient, what was the philosophy of knowledge in the very ancient, particularly in the Jain philosophy? The Jain philosophy, the philosophy of knowledge was that every knowledge, every description has something like a relativistic stature. And they came with this very assertion, particularly this we may find in Brahmanical thought, Buddhist thought, and Jain thought, in all these thoughts or philosophical systems. But Jain philosophy very emphatically says about the relativistic value of the knowledge. And the word they use is called Syadvad. Syadvad. Syadvad means this is something like a statement about a reality which is correct, but this is correct not in all the circumstances. This is correct in a particular circumstance. So Syadvad means to make a statement saying that this very statement about the reality is correct in a particular condition or in a particular frame of reference. So the frame of reference has something like a value for the description, of a thing. Phenomenal, we in the philosophy of knowledge, we discuss about this worldly, the phenomenal world, and then beyond this phenomenal world. This phenomenal world, when I'm using phenomenal world, means the world which is a spatio, temporal and material. Space, time and matter. This space, time and matter which we see it, which we interact, that is something like a world, which is something like a domain of what we call even the science. Science, or the Newtonian science, if I'm to be very exact. Newtonian science has something like to grapple with the spatio-time and matter continuum. Space-time matter continuum is grappled by Newtonian paradigm or Newtonian conceptual scheme. And the revolution in that very scheme came with the Einsteinian understanding of the world. In the Einsteinian understanding of the world, and particularly one person's name, I would like to mention Schrödinger. There was a Schrödinger's way of looking to the position of the electron. And then he came up with the idea of the probabilistic description of the location of electron in the context of time. So there comes up something like a philosophy of a tentative description or a probabilistic description. This very probabilistic description, which is something like the foundation of postmodernism. What is postmodernism? Postmodernism is an episteme or epistemology which comes up challenging the modern episteme, the modern epistemology. And what is modern epistemology, historically speaking? Modern epistemology is that which came into existence challenging the thought processes which emerged in the form of, I should say, enlightenment. There was something like a movement after Renaissance that was called Enlightenment movement. Enlightenment movement was something like rationally trying to understand through ideational approach the world. And then from enlightened movement, from the womb of the enlightenment movement, the understanding, the Newtonian understanding came to, to particularly emphasize that not only uh, ideas or not only the enlightened ideas are important, the important thing for the understanding of the reality is to have something like an empirical understanding of the reality. They use the word empirical. Empirical means what is to be testified, the thing which is to be verified, the thing which is to be observed, verified, testified. Then anything which is verified, testified, that is called empirical, then that would be considered as something like truth. Something like truth. Truth is that which is verified. That which cannot be verified is not truth. This is modernism. In modernism, the whole gamut of knowledge, from the social sciences to natural sciences to other branches even of art, came from this very understanding that they wanted something like the description of the reality based on the empirical understanding of the world. And when postmodernism came to challenge this modernism, then they said that all the descriptions which claimed telling something like truth, all those descriptions were based on certain assumptions, and those assumptions were something like unrealistic assumptions. The modernist assumptions to grapple with the reality were challenged. The assumption about the description of the reality, they said that your description is a tentative description. It is not an exhaustive description. Then this is very important statement, that this phenomenal world cannot be exhaustively explained. It can be in a very selective manner. Certain things can be told, certain things can be described. So this phenomenal world is subject to selective description because of its being inexhaustible. This word inexhaustible, this word has been used by Lenin also in describing even Marxist-Leninist framework, particularly Lenin, when he discusses about empirical criticism and logico-positivism. There he comes up with an axiom or a position that this world is inexhaustible, means you cannot describe it exhaustively. You can describe this world from a very selective perspective. And from that very posture or position or knowledge position comes up the postmodernism, that whatever the things which were considered as truth and final, those things which were considered truth and final, or the edifice of knowledge which developed on that, was challenged, like the concepts in political science, in social sciences, in history, the concept of nationalism, particularly I am talking about how nationalism was considered something like a construction. Nationalism is not something like a reality as such. It may be a reality, but it is a construction. And when you come up with a construction, that is a conceptual building block, so it tells you less and hides more. Any description which tells you, this is postmodern posture, that all the descriptions, they describe less, they hide more. And one will require certainly an introspection about this very statement, that how all the descriptions, they describe less, they hide more, because this world is inexhaustible, and whatever you describe, that is very minuscule part of this world. So your description is not an exhaustive description of the world. So this very posture came to challenge one concept of modernism, that was meta-narrative. Now, what is meta-narrative? A narrative which is of encyclopedic nature. Like, like as I told you, like suppose people say that there would be class struggle, then after class struggle there would come something like a state, there would be a proletarian dictatorship, and these are the umbrella concepts and the umbrella descriptions, and these descriptions, they hide certain very smaller things in the reality. Like when you talk about nationalism, then you forget talking about the feelings of those who are at the very micro level of the society. What is the voice of the unsung? Unsung. In any society, there are persons who are not heard, who are not described, because of the broad description of certain things, which start speaking about the things which are very minuscule and very meager at a very micro level. So postmodernism is something, an epistemic position, which is standing for the very minuscule, very neglected, if ideologically speaking, very neglected persons, very neglected communities. So postmodernism came into existence as a challenge. I'm in a very sweeping manner, I'm saying postmodernism came to challenge nation state. Nation state is something like a concept where a nation which is given something like a name, and then that nation, whosoever commands that nation, then he or she starts speaking about everyone. So that is something like a mesmerism, something like a hypnotism. The whole society is hypnotized by certain concepts, and then they fail to understand that there are other aspects of the social process and realities. So postmodernism emphasizes that the reality is multifaceted. Reality is not something which is described as in modernist approach. Reality is described in a very wholesale manner, in a very totalitarian manner. Like suppose I'm giving you the example of freedom movement in India. How freedom movement in India, when it is discussed, then people discuss about the mainstream of the freedom movement. Then they discuss about the movement which was led by Mahatma Gandhi. And then along with that very mainstream description, the people also they forget, I should say, or they don't describe or give importance to those who were marginal in the society. So postmodernism here stands and says that when you are going to speak about what you describe mainstream historical phenomenon, then you smother, then you hide, then you guard, then you just censor those events also which are very important, like those who were at the fringe of the society, those who had their voice, their aspirations, but because of a dominant ideology, because of a dominant worldview, those voices were not heard. But I'm just saying that with the emergence of technology, with the emergence of information revolution, the modern information revolution, I should say that more and more opportunities for the assertion of those who are neglected and at the fringe of the society, their voices are also being heard, or are they are in a better position to make people listen to them. Uh, with these preliminary statements about modernism and postmodernism, I would like to just share my understanding of how the research, I grappled with the research, and how I uh, just oriented my students also for research. And my posture had been, I should say, later on, I was very much in the very beginning of my career, I was very much influenced by Marxist approach. But gradually I realized that Marxist approach is something like a good approach, but it has certain conceptual schemes which which tell you about the reality, but they sometimes hide certain aspects of the reality also, because there are certain premises in Marxism, like social being determines social consciousness. This is something like a basic premise of Marxism, that social being means how the things are being produced and how the things are distributed. That is the social being, the infrastructure of the society that decides the superstructure of the society. This is something like a basic understanding of Marxism, which was very much described in the Marxist, particularly the writing of the critique of an introduction to the critique of political economy. There he discusses about the infrastructure or the basic structure and the superstructure. So these conceptual schemes, when they apply to the study of the society and history from the very ancient to the modern, then they come up with something like a great gamut of literature, which we call the Marxist history. But in that very history, that is something like a thesis in the dialectical sense, I'm saying, the whole Marxian literature is something like a thesis. Then the antithesis of that also came, that certain things which are not under the ambit of this very description, those things were also to be considered, like how far the superstructure is relatively autonomous or independent from the infrastructure. And in history, it was found that the superstructure, or the structure of the ideas, or the ideational structure, sometimes or in certain cases decided the infrastructure. So my experience had been that earlier I tried to understand the historical reality from the Marxist perspective. Then when gradually with my career, I should say it was 1980s, in 1983 joined as a lecturer in Banaras University. This was the period, the 1980s was the period of Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is a postmodernist writer who I should say, raises very fundamental questions about understanding the reality, like his writing on archaeology of knowledge. Archaeology of knowledge is a very encyclopedic book where he traces how certain ideas in the very beginning, how they began in the very beginning. Any idea, if someone has to understand any particular idea, then one will also have to understand the archaeology of it. Here the word archaeology is very pertinent. Means how in a very ancient, a very past, how that ideas germinated. And then he discusses, I think, almost all the aspects of life which are described by the anthropologists. We come across the ideas of anthropologists. I should say Michel Foucault was something like an anthropologist of the ideas, how ideas emanated in the society and how they were related with certain very basic things. And likewise, we discuss about uh, Noam Chomsky. How Noam Chomsky discusses about the language, and how language was considered something like a, a social construction, or something which is genetically coded in a person. So the contribution of Noam Chomsky to understand the society and the ideational world is very important, when he emphasizes that the language is genetically coded, and he gives several examples and says that how language can be understood uh, from the perspective of genetics. So I can go on explaining in an unlimited manner all these things, but I'm just saying that with the understanding of Noam Chomsky, and also understanding, I should say, of uh, particularly Michel Foucault, I came to understand, I should say, that all the things which were served in the name of history or history writing, they were to be considered as something like one of the narratives, historical narratives. In the 19th century, when scientific the modernism was very dominant, and the ideology or the philosophy of positivism was very dominant. Positivism is something like the ideology of modernism. So during that period, the concept of the history was such that in history there would be only one description of history, and that would be something like only one description. History is only one history. Now I should just submit that postmodernism has something like given a vista, given something like a, a, an opportunity, or something like a space. Postmodernism gave a space to the commoners or to any investigator, that history writing is something like the history writing is a possibility among the plethora of possibilities of writing history of a particular episode, or a particular time, or particular phenomenon. This very understanding of the possibility of plethora of narratives and the importance of narrative, postmodern, I should say, epistemology has several important things, but this is very important thing of postmodernism, is that how in different times the narratology or the narration is something like having an autonomous importance in the society, and the narration how motivates the people to behave or to think in a particular manner. So postmodernism emphasizes the analysis of the narrations or the narratology, and now at this very posture we can understand that how historical writing, all the historical writings having some ideological load, and the historical writings, they cannot be devoid of, bereft of ideological load. Every historical writing will be loaded with ideology. This very understanding is, I think, something like a contribution of postmodernism, that if you are going to read any book which is a book of history, then you can simply say that this book is, one should understand as to what is the ideology, or one should understand, like, even I should say Marxists were also very much particular to emphasize that they wanted to tell that they were writing history from the perspective of historical materialism. They were really in this very posture, I should say, they should be appreciated, that whenever a Marxist historian came up with a writing, then he or she comes up with this assertion that he or she is writing history from the paradigm or from the intellectual tool or from the philosophical posture of historical materialism. And they were the thing which to be criticized in Marxism was that there was nothing like a possibility or a space for an alternative narration. That was something like a negative thing in Marxist narratology, that they like the fanatics, the religious fanatics, they did not allow something like an alternative narrative. But their narrative, that they are basing their narration on the basis of historical materialism, that was something like a good narration, I should say. That was something like an honest narration. But there were certain there were certain practitioners who said that they were going to say certain things scientific, and then they came up with something like an emphasis for the value-free research. Value-free research. And then it is through postmodernism that it was very much understood through the methodology or technique of postmodernism that there would not be anything like a value-free research. You cannot have any value-free research, because a historian or a narrator has his own personal value system, which always, or which very much conditions, which enables, or which something like circumstances a writer to come up with a narration which is based on a particular value system. So this is something like an area which is understood, or which has been understood by the emphasis of postmodernism. And now postmodernism, when you apply postmodernism for the study of partition of India, as I have studied partition of India as a personal, I should say, area of my personal research, my personal investigation, I should use the word investigation. I read almost majority of the books on the partition of India. And then I realized that how the books on partition of India, how they can be classified as reflecting the nationalities of the writers. Like the British writers, when they discuss about the partition of India, their way of reality is something different. They might be different in their descriptions, but they have certain things very common to them. And likewise, if you study the partition history from the books of the historians of India, then you will have something, another type of narration. And India, if you are a rightist historian, then you will just, I mean, in a very simple manner, not going to distinguish all the rightists, categorizing them in different. Suppose someone is a Savarkarite. A Savarkarite will try to understand the partition, the reality of partition, by simply emphasizing in a very, I should say, crude manner, the role of Gandhi. They would find that they have exhaustively served their intellectual purpose by just blaming Gandhi, that because of Gandhi and Gandhian way to the reality, Gandhian way to the freedom movement, that India was partitioned. And if you are going to study the writings of the Pakistani historians, then they would be coming with a narration where they would very much emphasize the two-nation theory. How two-nation theory, they would say that India was something like two-nation, it was never a nation, and because of two-nation and two warring nations, they would come up with a with a historical description of the arrival of the Muslims and the emergence of something like a culture which was something like a bank, the Hindu culture or the non-Muslim culture in India and the Muslim culture. They were like the two banks of a river. They never met. And that was something like resulted in the partition of India, or something you can say when Britishers left, then it was something like a natural consequence that India was partitioned in two nation states. Although the Islamic nation state was very much artificial in a particular sense, that Islamic nation could not tackle the issue of language, particularly the autonomy a language should have in any integrated national consolidation. Any national consolidation which has to stay for some time will have to look into the regional aspirations of the people. As India, that is Bharat, through its constitutional mechanisms, ensured the language aspirations of the Indian people to be honored and fulfilled. That's why India remained united, and it will always remain united because of the very federal nature and very democratic nature, very decentralized structure of the Indian state, very much enshrined in the Indian Constitution, that India remained with all the diversities. It remained united and it will remain united. And in contrast to that, in Pakistan, you find how Bangladesh, which came in 1971, how Pakistan, they were something like a language chauvinism was there, and that resulted in the partitioning. So I'm just saying that how Britishers, why Britishers did not give autonomy or freedom to almost, there were 562 states, native states they were called. So my research has been in this field, that I saw the transfer of power documents, which documents published by his government, His Majesty's government publication, the British government publication, and editor was N. Mansarg. His name is N. Mansarg. That is something like in 12 volumes in the library of Banaras University. In the last volume of that transfer of power document, I found the mind of the Britishers. Why Britishers did not want India to be given an independence or a transfer of power where all the native states would also enjoy something like a freedom. And there they very much mentions Balkanization of India, the word. How India should not be Balkanized. And Balkanized in the sense that how something like the Eastern Europe were having so many smaller states, and how from 1945 to 1950, how the Communist Party led by Soviet Union, and particularly Stalin, how is Stalin, because of something like an understanding among the winners of the Second World War, there was an understanding of the sphere of influence. But the understanding of along with the understanding of the sphere of influence, there was an understanding that something like a democratic government would emerge in different spheres of influence of France, Britain, or America and Russia. They were the winners. But how Stalin engineered puppet governments came into existence in the eastern part of Germany, like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and those who became later on in 1956 the Warsaw Pact countries. So that was something in 1945 that was very much considered by the military strategists of the British, the British military strategists, their military leaders. They discussed, and that is very much mentioned in that very transfer of power document, that if India is given something like a state, something like a result where different states are there, different states, smaller states are there, then Stalin would engineer coup d'etat there or engineer something like puppet governments. That's why they, they mandated to the native states that with the end of the paramountcy, when paramountcy means the status of being supreme power in India, that very paramountcy, when it ends with the leaving of India by British, when the paramountcy ends, then the transfer of power would go to, to bigger states. If I am just saying, I'm just proposing that if Britishers were given something like an option, or if they had the option, or anyhow, if the historical events could have traveled in such a way that the British could not have managed to counterbalance Congress Party in 1939. Congress Party in 1939, when the Second World War started, Congress Party resigned from the states. And to counterbalance that Congress Party at that time, the British government, they gave extra cover or extra care or extra leverage, extra weightage to the Muslim League. And the Muslim League took the opportunity under Jinnah to pass the resolution of Pakistan in 1940. And that resolution of Pakistan, which was passed in March 1940, was something like accepted by the government, British government, and particularly the Governor General at that time, Lord Linlithgow, in 1940, that is called August offer. In the month of August, they came up with this very description that in future, when transfer of power would take place, when there would be an independence in India, then we would see that those who are the dominant, I'm just translating, the dominant minorities or powerful minority, and particularly Muslims, they would not be compelled to continue to remain in one unit. That was something like an indirect acceptance of Pakistan in 1940 by the British. And that very acceptance, because of 1939 to 45, the war continued. From 1944, there was Shimla Agreement, and then Lord Wavell was there, and how Lord Wavell was not so much accepted by the Congress Party, and how he was critically criticized, then he had to leave. And then Lord Mountbatten comes, and when Lord Mountbatten comes, and when 20th June 1947 scheme comes up for the transfer of power and the partition of India, then it was Lord Mountbatten who convened a meeting of the native states and said that you cannot remain independent, either join Pakistan or join India. You would not be given something like independent status. And everyone knows how Hyderabad and how Travancore, how Junagadh, how Kashmir, they had this story that they wanted to become independent. But as per the British scheme of the things, they wanted that either of these two dominions, Pakistan and India, India and Pakistan, they should be joined by these native states. So I'm just proposing here that how something like a historical process like partition of India, which took place, can be seen from different perspectives. And this different, the seeing of the reality and process of different perspectives, process of different contours of the description, different locus, I should say, different locus of descriptions which partition is subjected to. That is something a postmodernist epistemic scholar would accept as something like a valid description. And one would derive something like wisdom or knowledge from plethora of writings. This is something like a a description which I used to say that history writing is not something like a one narration. This is something like a multiple narration, and this very multiple narration is very much now possible. This very possibility of just accepting multiple narrations in a democratic manner, I should say. Actually, there was a time from the left and right both that, and still it is continuing, that you have only to have one narration. Other narrations will be smothered. That is something like a fascist way of looking to the reality. The postmodernism has or is going to do more and more, I should say, damage, if it can be called as damage, to the fascist way of thinking about the social reality. Fascist way of thinking the social reality is that this very description which a fascist has done, that should never be challenged. That is something like a fascism in historical writings. Postmodernism is something like anti-fascism to the historical writings in history. So with these words, I take permission, and just I say that now I should end. And if there is any question, someone may ask question on WhatsApp, and I would be there to answer. Or if any student at this very moment have some question, one may ask, I would be answering. Yes, of course, I give some time for the question answer session. Anyone may ask some basic question about understanding certain concepts, or whatever I said. If someone has to ask about asking me to explain certain things, I will be happy to explain. So the honorable audience is open and invited to ask questions. I think students would not be in a position to ask questions. They would listen my lecture. I would place this lecture on YouTube, so the student would listen to this lecture, and then again they may come up with the questions. They would listen to me, and I think because of the majority of the students of Hindi medium, they would have certainly a grievance that today I spoke everything in English. But I cannot help, because I think the students of Banaras University, they should also be knowing and understanding and speaking English, so that whenever they go to any interview, they should say that yes, they are coming from Banaras University, and they can have the command on English and Hindi both. So with these words, Professor Gangadharan, I thank you, and now take leave of you. And thank you for giving. Thank you for inviting me on this very day, when it is the 39th year day of my career in Banaras University. I would remain till 30th June as a teacher, I should say. Then I would finally formally retire on 30th June 2022. So, but actually this, yes.
बहुत धन्यवाद sir.
Can you hear me?
Thanks a lot, sir.
Dr. Sutapa, are you going to say something?
Yes.
Hello.
थैंक यू सर. और आपका ये आप रिटायरमेंट बोल रहे हैं, तो मुझे ये शब्द सुन के थोड़ा अजीब सा लग रहा है, क्योंकि एकेडमिक्स में कोई रिटायरमेंट नहीं होता है. यू आर स्टिल वेरी एक्टिव, एंड आई विश यू यू रिमेन so that
thank you very much. I would always remain active. Whenever Gangadharan ji would call me to speak something and to share my views, I would be there, and I would always love to interact with the students and teachers of Banaras University.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.